Ambassador William Taylor is an American diplomat, government official, and former military officer. He was U.S. ambassador to Ukraine from 2006 to 2009 under Presidents Bush and Obama, and acting ambassador under President Trump. During the Arab Spring, he oversaw U.S. support to Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, and Syria. Taylor also served in various key diplomatic roles in Iraq and Afghanistan, and led U.S. assistance to the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. With that long and respected career, few American officials have more experience or a greater understanding of Ukraine and the threat Vladimir Putin and Russia now pose to the world. Well, Ambassador Taylor joins us now to discuss the Russian invasion of Ukraine and its effects around the globe. Welcome, Ambassador. First, for those who are tuning in, how would you characterize where we are in terms of the phase of the conflict, given these recent moves by Russia, the annexation, the civilian attacks, and of course, these Iranian drones as well, and the nuclear plant?
Yes, Rochelle. So, yeah, we're in a phase that is characterized by Ukrainians succeeding on the battlefield, and the Russians, desperate to change the subject, are trying to do other things. So President Putin, knowing that he's losing on the battlefield, is calling up reserves. He is conducting these referenda that you mentioned in parts of Ukraine. He says he's annexing parts of Ukraine. He's reminding us that he's got nuclear weapons. His problem, of course, Rochelle, is that he's losing on the battlefield. His soldiers are dropping their weapons in the northern part of Ukraine where they're fighting. They are abandoning their tanks. They're running away from the oncoming Ukrainian military, the soldiers. And so President Putin has a real problem on the battlefield. So he's trying to change it up. So far, unsuccessfully. His attempt to recruit more soldiers is failing. His attempt to placate the people on his right in Russian politics is failing. He sees the people in Russia fleeing the country. So President Putin has a real problem, Michelle, in all of these attempts to regain the momentum. He's failing in that.
And you mentioned an interesting word, which is desperation, which can push people into a lot of different directions. So as we talk red lines, the nuclear threat, how seriously is Putin considering a nuclear strike against Ukraine? And what would he be weighing in really making that choice?
So let me just say that I think the chances of the Russians using nuclear weapons is small, is very low. That said, when you have the president, the dictator of a big nation that has nuclear weapons, saying that he might use them in Ukraine, you have to take it seriously. And of course, the West does take it seriously. There's no higher priority for our intelligence agencies than to be sure that they have a careful watch over any indications in Russia that there's any preparation or any steps toward the use of nuclear weapons. So far, none. So far, there's no indication that they are taking these steps. We have to watch, we have to be careful, and we have to send the message to President Putin and the Russian military and the Russian people that there will be devastating consequences, catastrophic consequences, if they made a bad mistake, a bad decision, and used nuclear weapons in Ukraine. It would cost them dearly for all kinds of ways, which, to be clear, our government has made clear to the Russians. So that's an important part of deterrence. We don't want to see these weapons used. The Chinese and the Indians don't want to see these weapons used. The Russian people don't want to see these weapons used. And so that's the message that has to get through to President Putin. I think he must be hearing that.
So then you talk about what he might be hearing. Then what sort of conversations are likely happening within the Kremlin? You mentioned the oligarchs and the role that they play. What do you think is actually happening? Who's actually having Putin's ear at the moment?
You know, I don't think the oligarchs have his ear on military things. The oligarchs are probably telling President Putin that they're having great difficulty. Most of the big oligarchs that have anything to do with this war are sanctioned. They can't travel. Their assets are frozen. Their families can't travel. Their children can't go to school in England or in Great Britain or in the United States or wherever. So the oligarchs are under sanctions, and they're probably expressing concern, expressing the fact that they're not happy about this. However, they're probably not the key voices in Mr. Putin's ear when he's thinking about his problems that I talked about earlier on the battlefield in Ukraine. Those voices are probably well informed. That is, his interior, his intelligence services, his military, his defense officials. They're telling him probably what he wants to hear. So he may not be getting the best advice from them. He's a powerful man. They don't want to tell him things that he's not going to be happy about. So it's not entirely clear, Rochelle, in answer to your question, what he is actually hearing. What he can be sure of is that he's losing on the battlefield. And we know he understands that because he's calling up reserves. He knows his military is not doing well enough to stop the Ukrainians. Indeed, the Ukrainians are pushing his military back out of their country. The Ukrainians are pushing the Russians back out of Ukraine. And so President Putin has to call up the reserves. In order to do that, he has to be talking to his military and his recruitment services. So that message is clearly getting through.
And in terms of a red line for NATO, what is the tipping point that would perhaps have them escalate as they're seeing this escalation now with the drones, especially killing so many civilians at the moment?
So it's very, very clear to NATO what would happen if the Russians were to attack any NATO member. There's no doubt in the NATO members' mind. There's no doubt in the Russian mind, and President Putin's mind, that if the Russians were to again make this bad decision, this blunder, to attack a NATO member, that would ensure their defeat. That would ensure that would be like committing suicide. I don't think the Russians are totally irrational. I don't think they're suicidal. So I think, again, the chances of the Russians attacking NATO members is low. Can't discount it, have to be ready. NATO is clearly ready. NATO is building up its capabilities on its eastern front. NATO is providing weapons to the Ukrainians because that's the first line of defense. The Ukrainians are fighting the first line of defense. They are defending the rest of NATO, the rest of Europe, from the Russians. And so that's why the United States, as a leading NATO member, that's why other NATO nations are providing the weapons to Ukraine to defend Ukraine so that the Russians can't go further, can't go into Europe.
Now let's talk sanctions, another way that the West is trying to squeeze Russia. Now, we know that you have also pushed hard for these sanctions as well. But by all accounts, yes, it's affecting the economy, but it's not deterring Putin at the moment. What, if anything, would dampen his resolve at this point?
What will dampen his resolve, you're right, is not going to be sanctions. What sanctions are going to do is what you mentioned earlier, squeezing the economy. Sanctions make it more difficult for the Russian economy to continue to support this war. So that's the purpose of sanctions at this point. Make it hard for the Russians to be able to replace all these weapons, all these missiles, all these cruise missiles and guided missiles and airstrikes. All of those things cost money, and all of those things need to be replaced. And the sanctions make it harder to replace. However, you're exactly right. They have not deterred President Putin from this attack. You ask what's going to deter him, what's going to change his mind? Continuing to lose on the battlefield. And in order for him to continue to lose on the battlefield, we need to continue to provide more and heavier and stronger and longer range weapons to the Ukrainians so they can push the Russians back out.
Now, in terms of assistance, I know you mentioned China, but you also saw OPEC Plus deciding to cut production of oil, which in turn benefits Russia, which benefits from that. But what do decisions like this, whether it's on energy or perhaps these purchases from China and India, what does that do not just to the effectiveness of sanctions, but really the dynamics with the rest of the world?
So you're right to ask about the dynamics of the rest of the world. One place where those dynamics play out is in the UN. Now, we know that in the Security Council, UN Security Council, the Russians have a veto, and they used it. So that they can stop action there, but they can't stop action in the General Assembly, in the United Nations General Assembly, where there have been a series of votes to indicate this dynamic that you're asking about, the dynamic in the rest of the world about where nations stand. The Russians have lost every one of those votes. The most recent one, Rochelle, was last week, and 143 nations voted to condemn Russia. 143. There were 5 nations that supported Russia, 4 nations plus Russia that supported the Russian attack on Ukraine. So 143 to 5. Now, there were some abstentions. Some 38 nations abstained. But it's very interesting. The Chinese did not support the Russians. The Chinese did not vote with the Russians. The Chinese abstained. The Indians did not vote with the Russians. The Indians abstained. So the Russians couldn't even get these nations. And they've got this partnership with the Chinese, and they can't even get the Chinese to vote with them in the UN. And the Indians buy a lot of weapons from the Russians, so they want to try to stay on the good side of the Russians. And they didn't support the Russians in the UN. Maybe they realize that the Russian weapons aren't so good after all. Maybe that's one of the reasons that the Indians, but when you look at where the international community is in terms of UN votes or in other things, you see that people are not, even the Belarusians. So President Putin is trying to lean on the president of Belarus, President Lukashenko, to support him, to support Putin in this battle, in this fight. And President Lukashenko really doesn't want to do it because the Belarusian people don't support the war against Ukraine. They're supporting Ukraine against Russia. So even this close ally is hesitant to support Putin. So this is all to say that the dynamics, the international dynamics, are against the Russians and support the Ukrainians. And Rochelle, if there were, going back to our earlier conversation about nuclear use, if the Russians were to decide to use nuclear weapons, they would lose all support, all support. They would be even more of a pariah than they are right now.
So when you look at what is going to happen in terms of any sort of pathway to peace and what the world looks like at the end of this war and the relationships between Russia and the rest of the world, how do you see any sort of path to peace going from here?
The path to peace, that's the right question. The path to peace runs through Russian defeat on the battlefield. The Russians have to recognize that they are losing on the battlefield when they try to fight the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are pushing the Russians back out of their country. When the Ukrainians have pushed the Russians back out of their country, back beyond where the Russians were on February 23rd of this year, just before they started the invasion, when they're back toward the international boundaries that the Ukrainians want to reestablish, then President Putin probably looks for a way out and probably tries to come negotiate something. That's the way out. Eventual negotiations, when the Russians have been pushed way back into Russia, way back out of Ukraine, and then President Putin tries to salvage something from this horrible decision, this blunder. That's likely to be the path to peace.
Well, we'll see if that's a decision that Putin will take lightly. Obviously, a lot at stake here, and a lot of death, and a lot of people wondering what's going to happen next. We do appreciate you breaking down these dynamics for us, Ambassador William Taylor. Thank you so much.
Joe, good to be here.